Welcome to the Frontier AETC Project ECHO. I'm Kent Unruh, and I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Brian Wood, our medical director, to introduce our guest.
For everyone in the ECHO family, what we're going to do now is move to a 15-minute review from Dr. Ruanne Barnabas related to CROI updates related to prevention and PrEP. Dr. Barnabas, thank you for joining us again. I think many of you will remember Ruanne. Ruanne is an assistant professor here in Global Health and ID and one of our Madison Clinic providers, and I will turn it over to you, Ruanne.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be back. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about HIV prevention updates from CROI. Anne and I did not compare slides prior to this, but at the end of this talk, you might think that we did. I'm going to talk about the treatment as prevention studies and have a focus on partner testing, new approaches to PrEP, and discuss briefly one example of PrEP failure. So UNAIDS has set the targets of testing 90% of HIV positive persons, linking 90% of HIV positive persons to ART and achieving viral suppression among 90% of those on ART by 2020, and those targets are 95, 95, 95 for 2035. And the objective of this is to avert 28 million HIV infections by 2013, so a very ambitious goal, but with a very specific and worthy target. And what we saw at CROI 2016 were several examples of encouraging implementation study results for widespread testing linkage to ART and viral suppression. And the results that I'll show you today are mostly from sub-Saharan Africa, but have many lessons for us here in the US. One of the most encouraging examples was an example from Botswana, where they have worked very hard to have decentralized ART available. So no matter where you live in this very sparsely populated country, and even if you have access to just a very basic drug depot to pick up your ART, you can get ART wherever you are. And to assess the reach of this strategy, they did a random sample of 20% of households in Botswana, which was just over 12,000 people. It's not a densely populated country, of which 29% were HIV positive. They had very high rates of HIV knowledge. 83% knew they were HIV positive. 87% of those eligible were on ART, and 96% were virally suppressed, showing that this decentralized provision of ART can achieve the UNAIDS goals. They're very close. There were also preliminary data from 3 large treatment as prevention studies, and these studies explicitly want to show that HIV incidence will decrease with widespread test and treat studies. These are not the final results of the studies. Many of these studies have gone through a few rounds, and so for these 3 studies are the results of round 1, and the results are not by arm, and they're not all the results, as you can see from the blank cells in the table. But I wanted to show that for these big prevention studies, POP-ART or HPTN 074, SEARCH or TASP, and these are all in Southern African countries, South Africa, Zambia, Kenya, and Uganda. And you can see in the first column the extremely large size of these studies, over 100,000 people in the POP-ART study, over 70,000 in the SEARCH study, and the TASP study, they've just presented it for 28,000 people, but that's also a large cohort. Very high HIV prevalence, 16%, 8.5%, and about 30% in South Africa, and they have managed to achieve very high rates of testing, 89 and 98% of HIV positive persons knowing their status in the 2 studies. Just a quick word on the methods they use to achieve high knowledge of status. In POP-ART, they have community health advisors going from home to home doing testing. In the SEARCH study, it's a hybrid model of both community-based testing in the home and through community campaigns. And they've been particularly successful in integrating HIV testing with other health campaigns. So they have had testing for hypertension and diabetes. Very popular was their vision screening, and they have also offered cervical cancer screening. So they've achieved this very high knowledge of status. And in South Africa, they've also done home-based testing. POP-ART did present that 71% of persons who knew their status were on ART. And then SEARCH and TASP did present at the CROI meeting that overall in their studies, they're showing very high rates of viral suppression. 71% of all HIV-positive persons in Kenya and Uganda were virally suppressed. So they're following the test and treat strategy there. And in South Africa, viral suppression has increased to 50% from just 20% for all HIV positive persons. So very encouraging news. I wanted to quickly highlight the success of partner testing. So Carrie Farquhar's group presented results for partner testing of HIV positive women. And in this study, women were enrolled in either receiving partner testing at home, the HOPE intervention, or their partners were invited to test at the clinic. And home testing here doubled the uptake of testing among men, which is one of the hard-to-reach groups in Southern Africa. Her group, Dr. Farquhar's group, also presented the results of partner testing outreach to partners of HIV-infected individuals. And this was a cluster randomized study among over 1,000 index cases and 1,800 partners. And they found that immediate partner testing, so doing partner outreach and home testing, resulted in a 4-fold increase in testing and a 3-fold increase in linkage to care. And significantly, both studies found no significant social harms. So moving on to the next generation PrEP, there were 2 studies of rings, the dapivirine ring, and I'll present first the ASPIRE study results. So MTN-0210 or ASPIRE was a multi-center, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled phase 3 trial of a vaginal matrix ring containing the non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor dapivirine. And there's a picture of the ring, and the primary objectives were to determine the effectiveness and the safety of dapivirine. It was administered in a silicone elastomer vaginal matrix ring. It was inserted every 4 weeks, and the study was conducted in South Africa, Malawi, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. 2,629 women were enrolled and randomized to the 2 arms. Women were counseled to wear the ring continuously, and the new ring was provided at scheduled monthly visits, and the follow-up was for a minimum of a year, and all participants received a comprehensive package of HIV prevention services. Overall, the dapivirine ring had a 27% reduction in the rate of HIV acquisition compared to placebo. And here are the results: 71 infections in the dapivirine ring arm and 97 infections in the placebo ring arm, with an HIV incidence of 3.3 and 4.5 per 100 person years, so an effectiveness of 27%. And you can see in the Kaplan-Meier curve the separation between the lines for dapivirine and placebo. Importantly, again, there was no difference in safety between the arms. They also explored HIV protection effectiveness by age stratified categories, and this was really striking. So for in the youngest age groups, aged 18 to 21, there was no difference between the dapivirine ring and the placebo ring. In the 22 to 26-year-old, the effectiveness of the dapivirine ring was 56%, with a very high incidence of HIV, 6.1% per year. And in the 27 to 45-year age bracket, an effectiveness of 51%, with a lower incidence of 3%. You can see the accompanying Kaplan-Meier curves showing the separation for the older groups. In the same session at CROI, there was another ring study, another vaginal ring for HIV prevention in African women in South Africa and Uganda. And the study had a very similar design. Women aged 18 to 45 were enrolled, 2-to-1 randomization for the dapivirine ring and placebo, so 652 in the placebo ring arm and 1,307 women in the dapivirine ring arm. Women self-inserted and removed the ring at 4 weekly visits, and they had a fixed 2-year follow-up. And all participants received a comprehensive HIV-1 prevention package. And again, the results are really very similar. So 71 infections in the dapivirine arm and 56 seroconversions in the placebo arm, remembering that the arms were, of course, different sizes, twice the number of people in the dapivirine arm. The seroconversion rate was an incidence of 4.1 in the dapivirine arm and 6.1 in the placebo arm, so a reduction in HIV incidence of 31%. And you can see in the Kaplan-Meier curve the arms separating, but with this wide confidence interval of 0.9 to 51.5%. but a significant p-value of 0.04. And again, the same difference in age categories. So for the ring study compared to Aspire, 31% relative reduction in HIV incidence compared to 27%, and both found a higher reduction when looking at the older age groups. As a randomized analysis among older women older than 21 seemed to have a high efficacy. There were no safety concerns or clinically relevant differences in safety or adverse events between the study arms. Just to touch briefly on new formulations, so we heard from Anne the efficacy of new formulations for treatment. Both formulations are also being tested for PrEP. So cabotegravir, the long-acting injection which we heard about, also shows protection for PrEP, so it provided protection among 21 out of 24 macaques against IV challenge, so 2 doses of cabotegravir 2 weeks apart. And you can see in the black lines, those are untreated macaques, all whom seroconverted. And then in the different colored arms, the macaques who received the cabotegravir, providing in this graph 7 out of 8 were protected against IV challenge. And this mechanism for PrEP is targeted towards injection drug users, so overcoming the need for daily adherence. I'll remind you that in the Thai trial, where oral PrEP was used, the efficacy was 49%. So here, taking away the need for daily oral adherence, but of course needing the monthly or bi-monthly injections for protection against HIV. And then also nicely analogous to what Anne presented for TAF, TAF is also being investigated as an agent for PrEP because it's highly active against HIV. The in vitro efficacy is double that of TDF, and it has improved safety as we saw earlier. So FTC and TAF prevented rectal SHIV infection among macaques, and the efficacy was equal to that of FTC and TDF. And here you can see in the figure the infections in the placebo arm compared to no infections in FTC TAF. So in macaque models, both the long-acting cabotegravir and the formulation of FTC of TAF and FTC showing protection, and so both promising agents for PrEP as well as for treatment. And then just in the last minute to highlight the one case of PrEP, of an infection of HIV among a person who was using PrEP, so a 43-year-old man who had excellent PrEP adherence, both by self-report and by PrEP levels measured in dried blood spots. And this showed a seroconversion with multi-drug resistant HIV, including a 184V, so very high resistance against emtricitabine, and also integrase inhibitor resistance mutations. And the exposure, the source, the identity hasn't been shared, but it is someone who's been failing on Stribal, so cobicistat, elvitegravir, tenofovir, and emtricitabine regimens. So a word of caution: while PrEP has near 100% efficacy, there is the possibility of HIV acquisition for a highly resistant strain, including resistance against integrase inhibitors. And there are links to all the talks and my email address should you need to have any questions after this. Thanks very much.